Agricultural protests continue across many parts of Europe. The latest along the Polish-Ukraine border. Polish farmers resumed their protest this weekend, stopping 3 trucks at border crossings and spilling Ukrainian grain that these trucks were transporting. The vehicles were also damaged. Ukraine on Monday responded to the incident, calling on Poland to hold those responsible accountable. The protests are part of a wider action among Polish farmers. They're against some of the European Union's agricultural policies, including allowing cheap grain imports from Ukraine. And those EU agricultural policies are what's behind the growing protest across the continent. Farmers are demanding fair prices and less strict environmental regulations. We caught up with one of those farmers who met with the president of the EU Commission. Giles Gibson has that story.
Vincent Delabelle's family has been farming this same land in western Belgium for more than 300 years. With his herd of 70 dairy goats, he produces organic milk and goat's cheese. Vincent also took time away from his day job at the start of this month, joining thousands of farmers who took over central Brussels with a vast protest. And he was one of several farmers who sat down with top European officials that day.
I would say that we have been listened. It was really thanks to very high pressure from the protest, both here in Brussels, but all in the country and even all around Europe. At the same time, this was really important for us to be listened. It opened the doors, but now we really ask for concrete actions.
Vincent admits that his industry does have to change as well, saying relatively small farms like his are leading the way in adapting to climate change. This peaceful farm feels a long way away from the noise and the colour of the recent protests in Brussels. But farmers like Vincent say that their protest movement is just starting, that their dissatisfaction has been building up for many years now. The recent demonstrations have forced EU officials into almost immediate concessions, such as dropping plans for new restrictions on the use of pesticides.
The months ahead will not be easy. But I think we have an important opportunity now. It is clear to everyone in this House that our agri-food sectors, beginning with the farms, needs a long-term prospect and a willingness to listen to each other and to look for common solutions. We need to avoid the blame game and to find solutions for problems together.
The challenge in finding those solutions is that different farmers in different countries have different demands. For Vincent in Western Belgium, the EU's trade talks with Mercosur, made up of South American countries such as Brazil and Argentina, are top of mind.
The Mercosur, EU-Mercosur free trade is a very big threat for us because it would mean a lot of imports of very cheap meat and feed that are not produced with the same norm and the same standards as what we are doing. It would be a very unfair competition for all farmers and putting more pressure, on the prices and on the availability in the supermarkets as well. So this must be stopped.
So if the farmer protests rumble on into the summer and closer to the European elections, EU officials shouldn't kid themselves. They're negotiating with a group of people who measure out their time in seasons, not days, who often have a connection with their land and livelihood that goes back centuries. Giles Gibson for CGTN in Western Belgium.
Okay, it is a complex issue, so for more on the European farmers' strike, let's bring in Joel Salatin. He is the co-owner of Polyface Farms and editor of an industry publication, The Stockman Grass Farmer. Joel, thanks very much for helping us kind of put this in perspective, if you will. Firstly, let's begin by talking about what's driving the protest across Europe. There's going to be complaints about climate change issues, green energy. There's going to be concerns about economic issues, and of course, subsidies.
Yes, I think if we could cut to the chase on 2 items. The first one is that for roughly since World War II, the European Union has been subsidizing farmers so that right now farmers have become a dependent class. $60 billion per year in subsidies flow from the EU to farmers. Roughly half of all farmers' income in the EU comes directly as a subsidy payment. That creates an incredible dependency class, so that when there's a transition, you know, it affects them greatly. And of course, now with the Ukraine war and everything, you know, there's a lot of transition going on. I think the second element is just a basic, this is not just a farmer thing. This is kind of a, if you will, a peasant uprising against the you know, the lords of the EU, who are trying to do a top-down. That's why you see a broad-based coalition of blue-collar workers and different people joining the farmers that just feel disempowered from Brussels. It's a top-down thing. Spain's Minister of Agriculture, Luis Plunas, I think hit the nail on the head. He said the bottom line is that farmers feel disrespected and underappreciated, and they've just reached a tipping point, and they're ready to fight back.
Let's to kind of recount what has played out. Major streets in Paris, major thoroughfares have been blocked. They've been dumping dung at the places, lawmaking areas, whether it be capitals or legislators, things of that nature. You did bring up Ukraine, and I kind of want to get to that. Because of the situation in Ukraine, as I understand it, a lot of the EU made concessions. Okay, let's try to help Ukraine out, and we're going to make an effort to buy their grain. But that is really affecting farmers in neighboring Poland and other areas.
Yes, and it's a double whammy, because not only does it bring in cheap grain, but due to the sanctions against Putin, the cost of fertilizer has gone up, you know, upwards of 400%. I will tell you, though, having been in Europe many, many times, in fact, I'm going back with 2 trips this year into Austria, Hungary, and other areas there, that I've been in Netherlands many, many times. The last time I was there, I met a couple, for example, that had a 10-acre dairy farm with 100 cows.
Right.
And Sean, you can't have a 10-acre farm with 100 cows. And so the manure goes into the canals. The canals get plugged with vegetation, and the rural area smells like a toilet. And so there are real problems there. And listen, I'm a farmer. I love farmers.
Sure.
But farmers have to understand that they have taken these, you know, 80 years of huge subsidies and created a very centralized system. And then the EU has made regulations that made it much more difficult for smaller farmers, like you just interviewed right before I came on, to access the market with scaled prejudicial regulations that make it more difficult for small-scale people to be able to sell to their neighbors. I look at these protests and see these tractors. I mean, we have tractors on our farm, several of them, and we don't have tractors the size that I'm seeing in these things. You know, since 2005.
Yeah, those are some big tractors.
Yeah, since 2005, the EU has lost 1/3 of its farmers as they have consolidated and centralized.
You know, and you also talked about 10 acres, 100 cows. There's not even room for a salt lick in there. So what effect is this having on the economies?
Well, what happened? It's not the economy so much as the ecology. On the same visit I was there, the government was paying for dehydrating manure to send it back to the grain ships that were coming from Paraguay and Uruguay in South America that were feeding these dairy cows. So you have an incredibly you know, non-holistic, non-ecological system. In fact, in the Netherlands, there was a lot of subsidence in the land through tillage and oxygenation of the fields, and it was actually collapsing and becoming marshy again. Meanwhile, they had mountains of biomass they were digging out of the manure-clogged canals that was growing. Netherlands produces 4 times more nitrogen than any other EU country due to this concentration of livestock in the country. And that manure has to go somewhere, and it grows willows and vegetation in the canals that clog them. So they have these mountains of material, but the farmers are buying chemical fertilizers instead of composting that and using an organic, a carbon-centric approach.
Well, something,
so the truth is, the truth is there are alternatives. There are alternatives, but most farmers are older and they're not ready to make transitions. They're not ready to make.
Yeah. And
just
indeed,
like all of them.
these people are kind of stuck in their ways, and something is going to have to give. We know that the governments are beginning to make some concessions, so we'll see if that happens down the road. But Joel, we'd love to follow up with you down the road, but we certainly appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.